Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 45, The American Civil War, Part 2. Let me start this episode by saying I don't like doing this. That being, discussing military history. It's not a moral issue or a repugnance of violence. As my students will tell you, I tend to embrace violence as a great storytelling device and an attention grabber. It's not that I feel war is tedious with mundane details of forgettable military leaders and regimental formations. Like anything else, military history is history. It deserves to be remembered, scrutinized, and finally judged like all other veins of historical inquiry. The real reason is I'm not good at it. And this is not a lack for trying, mind you. In my experience, it is difficult to express the subtle nuances of the battlefield with such a large cast of characters. For me, reflecting on the ramifications and atrocities that subsequently follow the bloodshed is much easier. Luckily for the historian full of bloodlust, there's a cornucopia of places to get a complete look at warfare. Heck, there's even an entire channel dedicated to military history. Full budgets with an excellent production value far outmatch your humble narrator. You might say that they have a bit more firepower than myself. With that being said, here's my deep dive into some of the most important battles during the American Civil War. If you feel lost, I apologize in advance. If you find yourself lost in the reads, remember your guiding compass as an historian. Don't ask what, but ask why.
The First Battle of Bull Run. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas, marked the first major land battle of the American Civil War. On July 21, 1861, Union and Confederate armies clashed near Manassas Junction, Virginia. The engagement began when about 35,000 Union troops marched from the federal capital in Washington, D.C. to strike a Confederate force of 20,000 along a small river called Bull Run. After fighting on the defensive for most of the day, the rebels rallied and were able to break the Union right flank, sending the Federals into a chaotic retreat towards Washington. The Confederate victory gave the South a surge of confidence and shocked many in the North, who realized the North would not win the war as quickly as they had hoped. By July 1861, 2 months after Confederate troops opened fire on Fort Sumter to begin the Civil War, the Northern press and public were eager for the Union Army to advance on Richmond ahead of the planned meeting of the Confederate Congress there on July 20th. Encouraged by early victories by Union troops in Western Virginia and by the war fever spreading through the North, President Abraham Lincoln ordered Brigadier General Irvin McDowell to mount an offensive that would hit quickly and decisively at the enemy and open the way to Richmond, thus bringing the war to a mercifully quick end. The offensive would begin with an attack on more than 20,000 Confederate troops under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard camped near Manassas Junction, Virginia, along a little river known as Bull Run. The cautious McDowell, then in command of the 35,000 Union volunteer troops gathered in the federal capital, knew that his men were ill-prepared and pushed for a postponement of the advance to give him time for additional training. But Lincoln ordered him to begin the offensive nonetheless, reasoning that the rebel army consisted of similarly amateur soldiers. McDowell's army began moving out of Washington on July 16. Its slow movement allowed Beauregard to call on his fellow Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston for reinforcements. In command of some 11,000 rebels in the Shenandoah Valley, Johnston could outmaneuver a Union force in the region and march his men towards Manassas. McDowell's Union force struck on July 21, shelling the enemy across Bull Run, while more troops crossed the river at Sudley Ford to hit the Confederate left flank. Over 2 hours, 10,000 Federals gradually pushed back 4,500 rebels across the Warrington Turnpike and up Henry House Hill. Reporters, members of Congress, and other onlookers who had traveled from Washington and were watching the battle from the nearby countryside prematurely celebrated a Union victory. Still, Reinforcements from both Johnston and Beauregard's armies soon arrived on the battlefield to rally the Confederate troops. Both sides traded attacks and counterattacks near Henry House Hill in the afternoon. On Johnston and Beauregard's orders, more and more Confederate reinforcements arrived, even as the Federals struggled to coordinate assaults made by different regiments. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, both sides had an equal number of men on the battlefield. About 18,000 on each side were engaged at Bull Run, and Beauregard ordered a counterattack along the entire line. Screaming as they advanced the rebel yell that would become infamous among Union troops, the Confederates managed to break the Union line. As McDowell's Federals retreated chaotically across Bull Run, they ran headlong into hundreds of Washington civilians watching the battle while picnicking on the fields east of the river, now making their hasty retreat. The future leaders on both sides who fought at First Manassas were Ambrose E. Burnside and William T. Sherman, along with Confederates like Stuart, Wade Hampton, and most famously, Thomas J. Jackson. Jackson, a former professor at the Virginia Military Institute, led a Virginia brigade from the Shenandoah Valley into the battle at a critical moment, helping the Confederates hold an important high ground position at Henry House Hill. General Barnard told his men to take heart and look at Jackson standing there like a stone wall. In the battle, he earned his enduring nickname, Stonewall Jackson. The First Battle of Bull Run cost 3,000 Union casualties, compared with 1,750 for the Confederates. Its outcome sent Northerners who had expected a quick, decisive victory reeling and gave rejoicing Southerners a false hope that they could pull off a swift victory. Despite their success, Confederate troops were too disorganized to press their advantage and pursue the retreating Yankees, who reached Washington by July 22. Both sides would soon have to face the reality of a long, grueling conflict that would take an unimaginable toll on the country and its people. On the Confederate side, accusations flew between Johnston, Beauregard, and President Jefferson Davis over who was to blame for failing to pursue and crush the enemy after the battle. For the Union, Lincoln removed McDowell from command. He replaced him with George B. McClellan, who would retrain and reorganize Union troops defending Washington into a disciplined fighting force, after that known as the Army of the Potomac.
Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh allowed Union troops to penetrate the Confederate interior. The carnage was unprecedented, with the human toll being the greatest of any war on the American continent up to that date. The South's defeat at Shiloh ended the Confederacy's hopes of blocking the Union's advance into Mississippi, and doomed the Confederate military initiative in the West. With the loss of their commander, General Albert Sidney Johnston, in battle, Confederate morale plummeted. After the Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862, Confederate General Johnston withdrew from Kentucky and left much of the western and middle Tennessee to the Federals. This permitted Major General Ulysses S. Grant to push his troops toward Corinth, Mississippi, the strategic intersection of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, and the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, and a vital troop and supply conduit for the South. Alerted to the Union Army's position, Johnston intercepted the Federals 22 miles northeast of Corinth at Vicksburg Landing. The encounter proved devastating, not only for its tactical failure but for the disproportionate number of casualties. After Shiloh, both sides realized the magnitude of the conflict, which would be longer and bloodier than they could have imagined. To consolidate his forces and prepare for operations against Grant, Johnston marshals his forces at Corinth. The Confederate retreat is welcomed by Grant, whose Army of Tennessee needed time to prepare for its offensive up the Tennessee River. Grant's army camps at Vicksburg Landing, where it spends time drilling recruits and awaiting Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of Ohio. Grant is ordered not to engage the Confederates until he has been reinforced by Buell's army, marching overland from Nashville to meet him. Once combined, the two militaries will advance south on Corinth. Anticipating a Federal move against Corinth, Johnston and his 44,000-man Army of Mississippi plans to smash Grant's army at Vicksburg Landing before Buell can arrive with more Union troops. On April 3, Johnston placed his troops in motion, but heavy rains delayed his attack. By nightfall on April 5, his army is deployed for battle only 4 miles southwest of Vicksburg Landing, and pickets from both sides nervously exchange gunfire in the dense woods that evening. At daybreak, 3 corps of Confederate infantry storm out of the woods and sweep into the southernmost Federal camps, catching Grant's men unprepared. Intense fighting centers around Shiloh Church as the Confederates sweep the Union line from that area. Despite heavy fire on their position, Union troops counterattack but slowly lose ground and fall back northeast, toward Pittsburgh Landing. Throughout the morning, Confederate brigades force Grant's troops into defensive positions at Shiloh Church, the Peach Orchard, Water Oaks Pond, and a treacherous thicket of oaks posthumously named the Hornet's Nest by fortunate survivors. That afternoon, while leading an attack on the left end of the Union's Hornet's Nest line, Johnston is shot in the right knee. The bullet severs an artery, and the commander bleeds to death. General Pierre G.T. Beauregard is appointed the new Confederate commander. Believing his army victorious, Beauregard calls a halt to the attacks as darkness approaches. He is unaware that overnight, Buell arrives with reinforcements for Grant. The Union Army now has nearly 54,000 men near Pittsburgh Landing and outnumbers Beauregard's army of around 30,000. Grant's army launches their attack at 6 a.m. Beauregard immediately orders a counterattack. The Confederates are ultimately compelled to retreat and regroup all along their line. Beauregard demands a second counterattack, halting the Federals' advance but ending in a stalemate. The timber-clads USS Tyler and USS Lexington provide naval artillery support to Grant's left flank from the Tennessee River. At about 3 p.m., Beauregard realizes he is outnumbered and retreats toward Corinth, having already suffered tremendous casualties. On April 8, Grant dispatches Brigadier General William T. Sherman and Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood to ascertain the Confederates' position. At Fallen Timbers, 6 miles south of the battlefield, they encounter rebel cavalry under Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest charges into the Federals ahead of his troops and is shot by Federal infantry at point-blank range. Although he will later require complex surgery to remove the life-threatening bullet, Forrest's reckless aggression pays off. Federal forces flee in the direction of Pittsburgh Landing, allowing the Confederates to escape. The loss of life on both sides at Shiloh, ironically, it means place of peace in Hebrew, was staggering. Johnston's death damaged Confederate morale, particularly for President Jefferson Davis, who held Johnston high in personal and professional esteem. But there were other sad consequences of the battle as well. Grant, though victorious, was vilified in the press after being caught unprepared at Pittsburgh Landing on April 6. Critics called for him to be dismissed, but Abraham Lincoln defended his general, declaring, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Corinth fell to the Union by the end of May, allowing Grant to focus on gaining control of the Mississippi River.
Antietam. The Battle of Antietam occurred on September 17, 1862, at Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland. It pitted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia against Union General George McClellan's Army of the Potomac. It was the culmination of Lee's attempt to invade the North. The battle's outcome would be vital to shaping America's future, and it remains the deadliest one-day battle in all of American military history. There was a lot at stake for the Battle of Antietam. By midsummer 1862, President Abraham Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation, a document declaring freedom for all enslaved people in the so-called rebellious states, ready to go. But after several unexpected and demoralizing Union losses, including Major General John Pope's sound defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, it became clear the Confederacy wasn't going to be easy to crush. Lincoln's cabinet feared releasing the Emancipation Proclamation at that time would seem desperate and be difficult to enforce, so Lincoln decided to wait until another decisive Union victory. To further complicate matters, Republicans faced midterm elections in November of 1862, and their victory wasn't in the bag. Frustrated with Lincoln's policies and the war's course, Democrats launched an anti-war campaign, hoping to take over the U.S. House of Representatives. General Robert E. Lee also recognized dissent among Lincoln's ranks and hoped a battle victory on Union land might topple Lincoln's congressional support and help secure the Confederacy. In Europe, France and Great Britain anxiously watched America's war between the states. They'd remained on the sidelines so far. Still, As they endured cotton shortages and the South seemed to gain the upper hand, they considered legitimizing the Confederacy, a move with potentially drastic implications. After Lee thwarted the plan of General George B. McClellan to lay siege to Richmond, the capital of the Confederate States of America, in the Peninsula Campaign in the spring and summer of 1862, McClellan retreated. Hoping to take advantage of the Union's low morale and seeming ineptitude, Lee chose to push his army north across the Potomac and into Maryland, where they soon occupied the town of Frederick. On September 9, Lee issued Special Order 191 defining his Maryland campaign. His plan to enter Northern Territory divided his army, sending each unit to march on a specific town, Boonesborough and Hagerstown in Maryland, and Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg in West Virginia. After the Confederates abandoned their campsite around Frederick, McClellan's army moved in. What happened next was pivotal. On September 13, 2 Union soldiers, Private Barton W. Mitchell and Sergeant John M. Bloss, discovered a copy of Special Order 191 with detailed Confederate troop movements, allegedly wrapped around 3 cigars. And when Lee heard a copy of Special Order 191 was missing, he knew his scattered army was vulnerable and rushed to reunite its units. On September 14, at the base of South Mountain near Sharpsburg, Confederate Generals D.H. Hill's and James Longstreet's units encountered Union resistance and sustained heavy casualties. Lee planned to retreat to Virginia but changed his mind after hearing Confederate General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, better known as Stonewall Jackson, had captured Harper's Ferry. The Battle of Antietam began on September 17 as the fog lifted. Longstreet's and Hill's units formed the Confederate right and center flanks west of Antietam Creek, while Jackson's and Brigadier General John G. Walker's units formed the Confederate left side. Lee's troops were worn out and hungry, and many were sick. They watched as McClellan's army assembled along the creek's east side. Union forces outnumbered Confederates by 2 to 1, although McClellan thought Lee's forces were much more significant. Troops from both sides faced off across a 30-acre cornfield owned by David Miller. Union troops fired first at the Confederates' left flank, and the carnage began. Confederate troops ferociously fought off offensive after offensive to prevent being overrun, turning the cornfield into a massive killing field. Just 8 hours in, there were over 15,000 casualties. Near the center of the battlefield, another site of slaughter was a farm lane known as the Sunken Road, where Hill's division of approximately 2,600 men had piled fence rails along the road's embankment to fortify their position against Union Major General William H. French's 5,500 approaching troops. When the French's troops arrived, fighting ensued at close range. 3 hours later, Union troops had pushed the Confederates back, and over 5,000 men were either dead or injured. The action was so gory Sunken Road earned a new name, Bloody Lane. For more than 3 hours, fewer than 500 Confederate soldiers held Lower Bridge against multiple assaults by Union General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. After Burnside's troops finally took the bridge and had the Confederate right flank in sight, Confederate reinforcements arrived and pushed them back. As night fell, thousands of bodies littered the Antietam battlefield, and both sides regrouped and claimed their dead and wounded. 12 hours of intense and often close-range fighting with muskets and cannons had resulted in around 23,000 casualties, including an estimated 3,650 dead. The next day, as Lee began the painstaking job of moving his ravaged troops back to Virginia, McClellan, surprisingly, did nothing. Despite having the advantage, he allowed Lee to retreat without resistance. From his point of view, he'd accomplished his mission of forcing Lee's troops from Maryland and preventing a Confederate win on Union soil. President Lincoln, however, was displeased. He thought McClellan missed an excellent opportunity to kick the Army of Northern Virginia while they were down and potentially end the war. After the war-weary general repeatedly refused Lincoln's orders to pursue Lee's retreating troops, Lincoln removed McClellan from command on November 5, 1862. Military historians consider the Battle of Antietam a stalemate. Even so, the Union claimed victory. And keeping Confederates in their southern box enabled President Lincoln to release his Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, finally. Ironically, Lincoln's proclamation didn't free slaves in Maryland, one of a handful of slave states that had remained in the Union, since it only applied to enslaved people in rebel states. Still, it endorsed the idea that the war wasn't just about states' rights but also stopping slavery. The Union's claim of victory at Antietam and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is thought to be why Republicans held the House in the 1862 midterm elections. This further isolated the Confederacy and made it harder for them to resupply their troops and citizens. They also ended any hope of France and Great Britain acknowledging the Confederacy and coming to their aid. There has never been a bloodier day in American military history than September 17, 1862.
Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg marked the turning point of the Civil War. With more than 50,000 estimated casualties, the three-day engagement was the bloodiest single battle of the conflict. Gettysburg ended Confederate General Robert E. Lee's ambitious second quest to invade the North and bring the Civil War to a swift end. The loss there dashed the hopes of the Confederate States of America to become an independent nation. After a year of defensive victories in Virginia, Lee's objective was to win a battle north of the Mason-Dixon line in the hopes of forcing a negotiated end to the fighting. His loss at Gettysburg prevented him from realizing that goal. Instead, the defeated general fled south with a wagon train of wounded soldiers, straining toward the Potomac. Union General Meade failed to pursue the retreating army, missing a critical opportunity to trap Lee and force a Confederate surrender. The bitterly divisive war raged on for another 2 years. Early that morning, a Confederate division under Major General Henry Heth marches toward Gettysburg to seize supplies. In an unplanned engagement, they confront Union cavalry. Brigadier General John Buford slows the Confederate advance until the infantry of the Union 1 and 11 Corps under Major General John F. Reynolds arrives. Reynolds is killed in action. Soon Confederate reinforcements under Generals A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell reach the scene. By late afternoon, the wool-clad troops are battling ferociously in the sweltering heat. 30,000 Confederates overwhelm 20,000 Federals, who fall back through Gettysburg and fortify Cemetery Hill south of town. On the second day of battle, the Union defends a fishhook-shaped range of hills and ridges south of Gettysburg. The Confederates wrap around the Union position in a long line. That afternoon Lee launched a heavy assault commanded by Lieutenant General James Longstreet on the Union left flank. Fierce fighting rages at Devil's Den, Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, the Peach Orchard, and Cemetery Ridge as Longstreet's men close in on the Union position. Using their shorter interior lines, Union 2 Corps Commander Major General Winfield S. Hancock and others move reinforcements quickly to blunt Confederate advances. On the Federal right, Confederate demonstrations escalated into full-scale assaults on East Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Although the Confederates gain ground on both ends of their line, the Union defenders hold strong positions as darkness falls. Believing his enemy to be weakened, Lee seeks to capitalize on the previous day's gains with renewed attacks on the Union line. Heavy fighting resumes on Culp's Hill as Union troops attempt to recapture ground lost on the last day. Cavalry battles flare to the east and south. Still, the main event is a dramatic infantry assault by 12,500 Confederates commanded by Longstreet against the center of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Though understaffed, the Virginia Infantry Division of Brigadier General George E. Pickett constitutes about half of the attacking force. Pickett, ordered by Lee to advance his division toward the enemy through a mile of unprotected farmland, replies, "General, I have no division, but the order stands." During Pickett's charge, as it is famously known, only one Confederate brigade temporarily reaches the top of the ridge, afterward referred to as the high watermark of the Confederacy. This daring strategy ultimately proves a disastrous sacrifice for the Confederates, with casualties approaching 60%. They are repulsed by close-range Union rifle and artillery fire, and the Confederates retreat. Lee withdraws his army from Gettysburg late on the rainy afternoon of July 4 and limps back to Virginia with severely reduced ranks of wasted and battle-scarred men. As many as 51,000 soldiers from both armies were killed, wounded, captured, or missing in the three-day battle. The carnage is overwhelming, but the Union victory buoys Lincoln's hopes of ending the war. With Lee running south, Lincoln expected that Meade would intercept the Confederate troops and force their surrender. Meade has no such plan. Even as Lee's escape is hampered by flooding on the Potomac, Meade does not pursue them. When Lincoln learns of this missed opportunity on July 12, he laments, "We had only to stretch forth our hands and they were ours." Months later, in November 1863, a portion of the Gettysburg battlefield became a final resting place for the Union dead.
Vicksburg. The Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi, was the culmination of a long land and naval campaign by Union forces to capture a key strategic position during the American Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln recognized the significance of the town situated on a 200-foot bluff above the Mississippi River. On May 19, Grant ordered Sherman's corps to attack along the Graveyard Road northeast of town, hoping for a quick victory over a defeated foe. Pemberton, the engineer, had developed a series of solid works around Vicksburg, and the Federals were repulsed by the defenders of Stockade Redden, suffering 1,000 casualties. 3 days later, Union leaders made coordinated assaults, Sherman along the Graveyard Road, Major General James McPherson hitting the center from the Jackson Road, and Major General John McClernand attacking from the south along the lines of the Baldwin Ferry Road and the Southern Railroad of Mississippi. Although McClernand's men briefly penetrated what was called the Railroad Redoubt, all three columns were repulsed, with a total loss of over 3,000 men. These losses and the substantial Confederate defensive works convinced Grant to take the town by siege, cutting it off from all supplies. He initiated a plan that is still studied today as a classic example of how to conduct siege warfare. Reinforced to over 70,000 strong, for weeks, his men dug trenches that zigged and zagged but steadily brought them closer to Pemberton's positions. One group tunneled underneath the 3rd Louisiana Redden, named for its defenders, and on June 25 detonated barrels of black powder that blasted a hole in the works. Union soldiers surged into the breach only to be met by a counterattack. Desperate hand-to-hand fighting ensued for hours before the attackers were driven out. A second mine exploded on July 1 but was not followed up by an attack. That same day, Joe Johnston finally sent a relief force from reoccupied Jackson toward Vicksburg, but it was too late and did not play a role in the fighting. Inside Vicksburg, civilians huddled in caves to avoid the cannon shells fired daily from Grant's artillery around the town and the guns on the fleet in the river. Rebels had cut off food and other supplies from outside for a month and a half. Horses, dogs, cats, and reportedly even rats became part of the diet for soldiers and civilians alike. On July 3, Pemberton rode out to discuss surrender terms with Grant. Although he had been dubbed Unconditional Surrender Grant after his demands to the garrison at Tennessee's Fort Donelson the previous year, the Union commander agreed to parole Pemberton's men. The following day, July 4, Confederate soldiers began marching out and stacking their guns. Despite the prolonged shelling, the Confederates' losses during the siege had been light. Some 29,500 surrendered. With the fall of Confederate Gibraltar, the last remaining Southern stronghold on the Mississippi, Port Hudson, also capitulated. That same July 4, Robert E. Lee's army was retreating toward Virginia after defeating in the Battle of Gettysburg. Helena, Arkansas, fell to Union forces, and General William S. Rosecrans forced the Confederate Army of Tennessee to withdraw from the Middle Tennessee area to Chattanooga, just north of the Georgia state line. The winds of war had shifted in favor of the North. The Confederacy had been irretrievably divided east and west. Pemberton found the Confederate government was no longer willing to entrust him with the high command, and, remarkably, he resigned his commission and attempted to re-enlist as a private. Southern President Jefferson Davis commissioned him as a lieutenant colonel of artillery instead. Joseph Johnston briefly attempted to hold Jackson, but the Federals reoccupied it. The destruction there was so complete that it became known as Chimneyville, virtually all that was left. Johnston would lead the Army of Tennessee during most of the Atlanta campaign and again following the Southern debacle at Franklin and Nashville in the winter of 1864. He would surrender his army to Sherman near Bentonville, North Carolina, days after Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. Grant's reputation as a fighter who won tough battles was cemented at Vicksburg, and by the following summer, he would be in command of all Union armies in the field. He came to regret his decision to parole the Vicksburg garrison, however. Most of its men re-enlisted without being exchanged for Union prisoners, as was the custom, putting thousands more rifles back into the Southern ranks. As a result, Grant would virtually hold prisoner exchanges when he was promoted to command all armies, a decision that perhaps shortened the war but also condemned thousands of prisoners north and south to prolonged incarceration and death in the unsanitary conditions of overcrowded prisoner of war camps.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.